Welcome back, everyone. Those of you who've been listening to our program this morning about invasive species, let me reintroduce our panel. We have Pat Shea, who's a former national director of the Bureau of Land Management and is current research professor of biology at the University of Utah. Robert Hogard, the director of plant industry with the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food, and Aaron Eager, the Utah County weed supervisor. Now, we've been talking about the problem per se and a couple of solutions and the money and the budgets. One solution being a bio-warfare using animals to fight perhaps other insects, perhaps goats, to fight the problem of invasive species. But isn't there problems that sometimes develop even with the sprays and the weeds and the animals that when you introduce new aspects to the ecosystem?
Yes, I would say one of the unintended consequences, as Aaron mentioned, about a musk thistle, there's a weevil that eats the seeds. Mm-hmm. One of the unintended consequences of that is it also feeds occasionally on the native thistles that we have. And so that's an unintended consequence.
Now, is that bad that they eat the native thistles?
It can. We haven't had any concerns with them becoming endangered because of it, and usually it's just as an alternative to them, but it can be a problem. One of the others is the flea beetle, or the beetle that is being used on salt cedar. Mm-hmm. Is very, very effective on salt cedar. We'll brown it out, kill it, and now the problem is there's also an endangered bird called the southwestern willow flycatcher. The concern is that as the tamarisk came in and crowded out the willows, and now there's no place for those birds to nest. So we're hoping that the willows will come back in, and then they'll have their native habitat back. But those are some of the unintended consequences that way, at least from insect introductions.
And Pat, wasn't there a lawsuit over some chemical spraying, some kind of toxic spraying on the weeds?
Well, they're not toxic sprays. What has happened is a major agricultural chemical company, Monsanto, had developed a line of corn that you could spray Roundup, which kills insects that were dangerous, or not dangerous, but damage the food crop. And now they're having a problem, so it's claimed, with some pollinators, monarch butterflies, others that were necessary for that corn to be productive. So a group of ranchers have filed a lawsuit against Monsanto. And I think from a scientific point of view, the worst place you can resolve a scientific question is in a courtroom, because the people there, judges in particular, are not scientists. We do have enormous opportunities on the biotechnology side to develop further the green revolution that we've benefited from, where we've increased the productivity per acre around the world. India would not be as productive as it was today, or is today, without the green revolution. The next phase, in my judgment, is to find ways of attacking invasives in particular that are counter to producing food in a micro level. But you always have to look at the consequences.
When you say in a micro level, what do you
with bacteria, or with viruses, or with genetic modification of the genotype that produces both the weed and the crop you're trying to
Some people are quite afraid of introducing that micro level, the bacteria and other viruses.
Oh yeah, no, there's a fear. Frankenstein, or Frankenfoods is what my sister calls them. And I think in many senses have to overcome that by being educated. But it's also, science is not something that's done by the quarter or by the year. It's something that is really done by good scientific work in the lab and at our universities and in the private sector. And it takes time. It can't be done overnight.
Aaron, when you're discussing various methods in Utah County of attacking your invasive species problems, do you take into consideration the possibility that something could get loose in the ecosystem or destroy another beneficial plant or animal at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about all this, even spraying chemical, you've got to be concerned where you're spraying the chemical, because some people are real sensitive to it. With the Department of Water Quality, not all chemicals are labeled to even go near water or on water. So you always have to pay attention as where you're putting the chemical. And the other thing is if you go in and say you're spraying out a section, The other thing you got to think of is when all that goes, what's coming back? So you've got rid of the noxious weed you wanted to get rid of, and now it's an open landscape. Is another even worse invasive going to come into that area? We got to get better at actually looking at, okay, if we get rid of this, we got to put something back that's beneficial, something that can compete, that won't allow those seeds to come in.
Something has to fill the space.
Right.
How we manage landscapes, because nature abhors vacuums, and there will always be some organism that will creep in there. But one of the questions, which is an interesting one to me, I wrote my third-year law paper on the Clean Air Act, 1970. At that point, we were happy to measure 1 part per million. About 1990, we got so we could measure 1 part per billion, and just last decade, in the beginning of the 21st century, we could measure 1 part per trillion. So we have gone up 6-fold from where we had been. But does that tell us anything more about what we need? And that's where Aaron's point, we need to think of whole landscapes and how we want to try to manage, given that nature is always going to prevail. How can we nudge it a bit one way or the other to make it more productive to return to the well-being of organisms and humans?
That's a good point. There's so many competing interests involved in this. How do we solve
Well, and that's one of the problems. I was just going to say that's one of the problems with the invasive species. We talk about the concerns that we have if there is an endangered species, and we're worried about the unintended consequence of getting rid, say, of the salt cedar, and the southwestern willow flycatcher is the endangered species, is the concern that it's going to then become extinct. We hope that that's not the case, but if we leave it as is, it's already struggling if we're not doing something to get rid of the salt cedar. So that's the problem with the invasive species, is they are pushing out the natives and causing some of these problems with endangered, causing things to become endangered or threatened. You look at the sage grouse. Huge problem is cheatgrass. As it comes through and burns its habitat, then more cheatgrass comes back in, and you don't have a good habitat for that sage grouse. So we need to work on creating habitat, and as you were mentioning, Pat, that comes from nudging Mother Nature. We don't need to go in and just spray it all. We just need to get it to a manageable level, and then Mother Nature will help it take care of itself.
Is it nice to nudge Mother Nature?
Sometimes she doesn't like it, but generally speaking, it works well.
Are we getting better at this, Pat?
Well, I think on the fire side, you see dramatic changes in being able to do restoration and rehab after a fire. When we had the Cedar Flat, or the fire down by Cedar City, it was the first time in my career where I saw interagency cooperation from the federal all the way down to the city and township level. And I think we're beginning to see that these 19th century governmental lines that we work with are not necessarily the way that we can address Mother Nature with respect.
Yeah, Milford Flats Fire is an excellent example because it covered such a large area. I think the largest ever in Utah, and I covered it as a reporter. Has the effect been beneficial? Have the good plants moved back in, or are we seeing a resurgence of the invasives?
But can I just quickly show you an unintended consequences? The prevailing wind in the Milford Flats was south to north. So if you're going to plant something, you want the burrows to run north to south, so the wind erosion is going to be minimized. Somebody, without knowing it, made it go east to west. So we have satellite photographs of this incredible wind erosion after the fire that took away a lot of the topsoil. So yeah, it was very effective in comparison to what had been done in the past, but it was nowhere near as effective as it needed to be.
Right. Yeah, and they spent millions of dollars to reseed those areas, and some of them are looking very, very good, especially after last year. But we have the blowout areas still that we cannot get seedlings. We get them up and started, and then the wind blows and slices them off as the dirt blows across them. So,
You know, I've seen from over the last 6 years more emphasis on the restoration. All of the, whether you use through the Department of Agriculture, a grant through them, or a grant through the Watershed Restoration Initiative, all of the people who are managing those grants are now requiring, are you doing a restoration component? It's not good enough to go in and clean an area up, or you bring them back natives and put them there. Basically, they want to see that you have a plan for an end result of that piece of property, which is a good thing. And that's at big level all the way down to a $1,000 grant.
And does the $1 million the state has set aside to fight invasive species also include restoration money?
yes, Yeah, and it needs to be, and the hard part is depending on how long that noxious weed has been there, if you can get it out of the road, sometimes the natives will just come back on their own. Other times, if they've been there a long time, those seeds have died and you need to come in and replant. So it does have a component for these $1 million. Almost all of them have a revegetation component.
But see, one of the things that has been frustrating to me is the fire people, wildland fire, think of fighting the fire, and then somebody else comes in and does the rehab and restoration. And we need to have a more integrated approach. So as you're fighting the fire, you're thinking about what you're going to do to restore it so that both it's more fire resistant, it creates a healthy watershed, and it's sustainable.
Sounds like that'd be rather difficult, though, if you're looking at flames racing up a hillside towards you. Tell you what, we'll take a break, and we'll be back in just a moment. Thank you, Jim.